So today is exciting because it is kind of the last day of new information from period one. Obviously, we're going to spend some time reviewing, but what I'm going to walk you through today is going to be just kind of overreaching concepts of period one from the late 1400s to the mid 1600s. So, just a little information as we kind of go through and just discuss what life was like outside of all the things we've kind of been talking about. So during the 16th and 17th centuries, most Europeans still maintained their livelihood from peasant agriculture, growing crops enough to eat, that type of thing, and paying rent and taxes to their lords, which is, an example of feudalism. So life for most people is not going to change, especially people living in Eastern areas like Russia and Poland and places like that. Most farms at the time relied heavily on manual labor and used a three crop rotation system where basically, they would switch it over here, they'd grow something here, and then leave the ground fallow or empty so to let the nutrients kind of replenish themselves. But it's wasting a third of the field. So we're eventually, next period going to talk about the agricultural revolution where they replaced this three crop rotation system with a four crop rotation system. Unfortunately for peasants, increases in population during the 16th century meant prices rose higher than wages did. Remember, the price revolution helped with that. This caused peasant families to be poorer and reduced their standard of living. So, while economic conditions lowered standards of the living, they were raised again by the 16th century after the price revolution. Additionally, advances in education and harsh economic pressures delayed marriages, resulting in smaller families. The reason it's going to result in smaller families is because you're only having kids if you're married at this point, and people were waiting longer to get married because they couldn't afford to go out on their own and start a life because wages were so low, poverty was widespread. This left fewer people around to use money supply because of the smaller families, and that's actually going to raise living standards, especially after the 30 Years' War. Because remember, we said a third of German people were killed from war, starvation, disease during the 30 Years' War. And if there's less people to work, that work then becomes more valuable and can raise the wages. While the printing press helped spread literature, the vast majority of Europeans were still uneducated, illiterate peasants. And however, the printing press did play a pivotal role in establishing vernacular or local spoken language such as English, German, Italian, and French. So let's look at families. Much like Paleolithic societies, peasant families work together in an equal kind of manner, but they're going to do different things. While men did more strength-oriented labor, women are also going to assist men with agriculture, doing separate but complementary tasks. They're going to be doing different things, but the jobs of both of them are going to be important for survival of the family. Families worked and lived in small units, enjoyed time together, and lived in very small, well-known local communities. The role of women is mostly going to remain subordinate to their husbands because men still have all type of legal control. An example of that is, during this time in the Renaissance and, period one, women were allowed to inherit businesses or property, but they weren't allowed to expand or train their own employees. So they do have some rights, but really not many. While women remained subordinate to men in the early Middle Europe, the Reformations and Renaissance raised a question about female education. Remember, Martin Luther thought everybody should be educated in the Bible, so that would include women too. Some women, such as writer Christine de Pizan, who hopefully you should remember, women said women were just as intelligent as men were, but it's just the only reason they're not, holding these jobs and as educated as men are is because they weren't allowed to go to school. They weren't given the same educational opportunities. Additionally, some Protestants, mostly those deemed radical, believed women could play a more active role as a pastor or preacher. Protestant women also played a major part in the Reformation by offering funds to Protestant writers and princes who fought to defend Protestantism. And lastly, women had an impact on the arts. Again, remember, if we go back to Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, a true Renaissance woman would, inspire or patronize art, but never create it themselves. But there are exceptions to this that we've talked about. So the key concepts, feel free to go through and hopefully you read through and you're like, boom, yes, got it, got it, got it, as we go through and we're going to finish the rest of the notes here. So, city life. As large amounts of people began urbanizing due to the enclosure movements, cities and authorities were largely unprepared to handle this urbanization and this new growth of cities. While cities offered construction work for men as food processors and innkeepers, most people were unemployed and extremely poor. Crime and disease are going to run rampant, and a lack of sanitation made life miserable for citizens. Where you got a lot of people living in an area, there's no sewer, there's no indoor plumbing, disgusting conditions. While the church was largely gone or irrelevant in Protestant Europe, cities and governments were forced to stricter laws on begging and prostitution because cities became overwhelmed with these two crimes. And many Protestant areas also began to ban carnival, which is like a celebration. We'll talk about that a little bit. So while the church was largely uninvolved with crimes or punishments, the old medieval punishments were still used by secular or separated from religious authorities. Punishment remained public. Stocks, branding. You can see someone in stocks up there. Whipping and torture, all still very common. Mostly in Catholic states, also maintained religious law and book bans. Many, like Philip II, continued to use the Inquisition to convert or execute heretics. We talked a lot about that, and there you just see one of the stocks. Obviously, being tortured there in public, so it looks like a little bit of the Inquisition. If I look back and I see the cross back there. So while governments and economies had all begun to change quite drastically, the way people relaxed, celebrated, and spent their free time remained largely the same. Leisure activities were still tied directly to the church and agricultural cycle and still reflected the emergence of magic and folklore. Events such as carnival, and you can see an example of that, people dressing up and, reversing roles in society. And religious festivals revolved around the harvest, and many people still took part. Um, there was also blood sports such as bull baiting and bear baiting or animals fighting. You can see here they have a bunch of dogs attacking one bull to see how many it'll take to take it down. Same thing here. You see a guy that looks like he has some type of stick or sword with dogs attacking a bear. So these blood sports are what they sound like, sports of blood. A lot of animals, fighting each other. And a lot of these old beliefs, even though we just talked about the scientific revolution and some other things, are still going to exist. So while the scientific revolution had brought out new ideas and techniques for solving the world's mysteries, most people are still going to believe, in magic and this folklore. Witchcraft, curses, blessings, porcelain, and magic were all extremely superstitious, but all pretty much widely believed. The belief that sickness and plague were either curses, hexes, or punishment for bad behavior or sin. In fact, despite a growing scientific community, witch hunts and killings peaked in the late 1500s and early 1600s. Remember, Salem witch trials, even in the United States, it happened. I know that's not European history, so that's not an example of European history, but the same things were happening in European countries as well. People also still believed actions such as volcanoes or comets in the sky were consequences of bad behavior or omens of bad things to come. So you can see, even in this time of the scientific revolution, the same way the Renaissance didn't affect most people, these ideas aren't just developed and believed overnight. They take a very, very long time. And obviously, there's still a lot of people that believe in witchcraft and magic and things like that today. This slide, not really worried about. It's everything that I feel like we went over. Again, going through the key concepts at some point on your own just to make sure that you feel good about them. There's a lot here at the end of period one, so that would be helpful. So we have covered pretty much everything we're going to from the year 1450 to 1648 under period one. We're going to go into the next couple of days and start reviewing, getting ready for our period one test, but more importantly, making sure we have the major concepts of period one down, the people, the art, the wars, the literary movements. And so we're going to begin to review that before we take our test coming up. If you have any questions, go ahead and send me a message. Otherwise, enjoy your Tuesday.